I briefly already talked to you about this. Basically, CFS was the Committee on World Food Security was created in '74. The GATT Uruguayan round and trade liberalization happened in '94. In '95, not by accident, the term food sovereignty, that means it was labeled by the social movements, especially by the peasant movement, pastoralist, and fisherfolk movement in the world. And they had a conference in Mexico, and they established that their banner was that peoples and states should have the liberty and the freedom to decide their own food policies and agricultural policies on the basis of their habits and their, cultural identity. And this has been the banner of the movement that has been fighting the issue of full free trade liberalization of agriculture. In '96, the governments that were not very happy with the GATT agreement had called for a World Food Summit. Basically, heads of state met in Rome to discuss how to guarantee food for everybody. And that's why I said they decided to cut hunger in half in 15 years. 5 years later, they met again in 2002. They didn't meet in 2001 because it was exactly on the date of the 2001, the 9/11 event in the United States, and the meeting was canceled and was transferred to 2002. In 2002, the meeting evaluated what was the evolution between '96 and 2002. And you remember that in those pictures that I showed you, that graph, from '96 to 2002, hunger increased instead of reducing. So in 2002, they decided that more needed to be done in relation to food security than it was being done. And they decided to really call for a human rights approach to that. The governments decided. And on the basis of that, there was a big effort of the FAO and of the human rights system to develop a framework for a rights-based approach to food and food crisis. In 2005, the crisis continued. The food problem continued. There was no reduction in number of hungry. But the OECD countries, especially the G8, the 8 countries most powerful in the world, had proposed a reform of the FAO, of the Food and Agricultural System. And the original proposal, especially by the UK, the United Kingdom, was to eliminate FAO, to extinguish FAO, because they felt that FAO was incapable of doing what they were doing. They should be extinguished. The reform started in 2005, and the idea was to transform FAO as it existed into an agency of technical assistance, basically, to the countries, but it would lose the political mandate of promoting food security and eradicating hunger, because the countries defended that the eradication of hunger would come from the free trade, liberalization of agricultural system. So as the US continues to defend today, the idea was that you don't need public regulation of food, trade, of finance, of the role of the hedge funds into price volatility or anything. That all would be solved by free trade only. The crisis of 2007, at the end of 2007, with the increased price of oil and the agrofuel boom, because you remember, there was a conjumination of things in 2007. First, the increased price in oil. Second, the climate change cry that said that a lot of the problems came from the use of derivatives of petroleum, led to interest of investing into biofuel, especially by the EU and especially by the US. If you remember, for some of you who may follow this, the US decided to use most of its corn for the production of ethanol to replace gasoline to reduce the impact of oil prices. And that led immediately to an increased prices of corn all over the world, especially in Mexico, leading to, because Mexico today depends on corn imports from the US after the structural adjustment and after NAFTA, the regional agreement on trade that allowed the US to export corn heavily to Mexico, and Mexico today is dependent on the US for the production of corn. This unleashed at the end of 2007, and all of a sudden there was this outcry: we need to strengthen the governance of food security. You see the contradiction? The OECD said that we needed to extinguish the FAO, reform the FAO, and extinguish the CFS, the Committee on World Food Security, 2 years before. Then in 2007, the crisis showed that the lack of public regulation and the total reliance on free market was allowing another food crisis to erupt. So due to this crisis, what happened was the whole thing was reversed. And that's what we're going to discuss now. Basically, the idea of extinguishing FAO was put in the drawer, and the idea of extinguishing the CFS was put in the drawer. And as a matter of fact, the final report of FAO reform said that if we didn't have FAO, we would have to invent it. So there was the report made by the group that was had in charge to eliminate it. So we already discussed this from a human rights perspective. The human food crisis for the people who have been chronically hungry is not new. It didn't happen in 2008. In our understanding, the problem is that the crisis that we're living today and still live today is a crisis of the model, of the hegemonic model of agricultural production, and the fact that the riots and the questions on the market are the basic problem that can be called as a crisis. We already talked about this, that international, and why do we say that it's a human rights problem? Because as we said, human rights are related to the issues between the people and the state. So human rights protect people from abuses of the state against the people, or require that the state protects people against abuses of other powers, economic, religious, or whatever. So human rights are there to regulate the role of the state. You see that there is a contradiction between human rights and the total freedom of markets. Human rights say that the total freedom of markets means that somebody is regulating and not necessarily the majority. The total freedom of markets in the sense, in a totally unleveled field as we have in the world today, with a few powerful countries, a few very powerful multinational corporations, and a lot of people that are still hungry, and a lot of people who do not participate in political processes, means that those very powerful regulate according to their own interests. Human rights ask governments to regulate the economy and the society according to the interests of the majority. So this tension is permanent. We're not going to end it. It's always going to be there. So the idea of the human rights is exactly to balance this interests of the minorities to guarantee that the majorities have their rights guaranteed. So we say that the crisis is a result of violations of human rights because it was caused by international and national policies that were led in line with the Washington Consensus under the G8, IFIs, and WTO lead. They were the reduction in investments in national agriculture in South, for instance, were the result of the structural adjustments that were imposed by the IMF and the World Bank, and also by the reduction of investments of governments on agriculture in overseas development assistance. You have heard probably recently that, for instance, overseas ODA, overseas development assistance in agriculture, was reduced from 20% 40 years ago to almost 2% in the last 10 years. And now it's back to 4.5%. So there was a twofold decision of the governments, especially in the north. The first was to impose the structural adjustment that required the local governments to reduce their production and their investment in agriculture and protection of agriculture. And on the other hand, they reduced their own overseas development agency assistance. At the same time, while these two things were happening in terms of policies, there was a strong support to agriculture, monoculture, agribusiness monoculture for export, input intensive. So at the same time you reduced the capacity of the national countries to produce, you stimulated the expansion of agribusiness. So this is the freedom. The agribusiness is free to do whatever they want. At the same time you impose limitations on the national governments and you don't invest in agriculture. So you leave open space for agribusiness to develop and to expand. And in parallel to that, there is another set of public policies developed by the EU, specifically in the US, that is what is called dumping. And those who are aware of that is the fact that even if you don't have direct subsidies to exports, the end product that is produced in Europe, and the surplus, can be sold in developing countries sometimes at lower prices than the local producers can produce because of the subsidies, the different types of subsidies, or even because of the structure of the system. And this has been documented over and over and over again, and it's not, I'm not saying that on my own account. There are thousands of studies on this direction. We did some specific studies in relation to Honduras, Indonesia, and Senegal, specifically on specific commodities, but it's clear that this is one of the big problems in affecting the capacity of local farmers to produce. And finally, so what we're saying here is that is not a food crisis is not a natural crisis. It's not a calamity. It's not due to conflicts only. It's a crisis caused by policies. So, after the crisis, once we had all these things that I already described, countries started to go for land grab, increased land grab. And I already described that to you. There is a totally inadequate public regulation mechanisms of food price speculation and of the market. And this, France has had a very interesting role in denouncing that and denouncing the role of hedge funds, for instance, in causing price volatility, speculation with food. Some banks even said, make money on food. And there were, in Switzerland, for instance, there were leaflets of banks. You can make 20% profit in 1 year by investing in markets, food markets. Basically, if the price, betting that the food prices will grow. So you make a profit because the prices will grow. So you're betting on making people less available to food, less access to food. And this is under discussion right now, heavily by the G8, by the G20, and they have tried to reach some agreements, but up to now, no agreement has been reached whatsoever. This is one of the biggest problems right now. The other thing that played a role was the climate change. And you see what happened that really was the basic cause for the big riots was the fact that on top of having increased international prices, the local national governments were unable to purchase the food, or the people were unable to purchase the food from their local national agricultures, and the prices were too high in the international market, so they couldn't buy it. Just one example. Haiti, for instance, is a small country, very poor country, but before the structural adjustment, it was self-sufficient in rice, produced 100% of their needs. After the structural adjustment that forced them to reduce investments in agriculture extension and all that, today they are dependent 80% on imports from the US. And that was imposed by the World Bank and by the IMF and all that. So that's what we say, that this crisis is a result of this set of policies. Okay, I will skip this. This is some of the land grabs that we are talking about. You know, the police really used to evict the people from the land that they have been occupying for sometimes, you know, hundreds of years, families, because they didn't have the legal title of the land, and then the government recognizes the right of that land to be from either a private company or another, some type of owner, and the police comes in to make the evictions. So, we already mentioned this, and I will talk about what did the international community do in reaction to the crisis, okay? Basically, the crisis erupted at the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, the riots and all that. In 2008, May 2008, the UN establishes a UN high-level task force on global food crisis that includes, you know, all the UN agencies, relevant UN agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, and WTO, and it excludes, in its first composition, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. It's interesting that despite the fact that the UN had recognized that human rights were an important component of trying to face the crisis, when they set up a task force, they exclude the human rights system. And this was the first fight that we had as civil society to guarantee that the human rights system was called back into the high-level task force. The high-level task force makes the diagnosis, and if you read the document that's called Comprehensive Framework for Action, that was written in 2008, it makes a diagnosis where it clearly says that the two biggest dangers of the crisis were political instability and the fact that, you know, this put in question the Doha Agreement and the liberalization of agriculture, free trade. This is in 2008. In June, 1 month after, the G8, under the leadership of Sarkozy, calls for a global partnership on agriculture, food security, and nutrition, led by the G8. What was the idea behind the global partnership? The global partnership should have the participation of the governments, of the UN, and of the private sector. The big seed companies, the big agribusiness companies, everybody involved in the process, and as well the governments. Okay? The response to that came almost immediately. In October 2008, governments that were not happy to have the G8 leading the global partnership, and especially because of the strong role of the private sector within the partnership, decided to reform the Committee on World Food Security. You remember that the World Food Security was created in '74 and was under threat of extinction. The Committee on World Food Security has 145 members, governed members. It is in charge of promoting food security and eradicating hunger. It's the body in charge of that in the UN. The governments inside the body decided to reform it and strengthen it. And this was done clearly in competition with the idea of the global partnership. The idea was that this committee should be the real body in charge of deciding how to deal with the food crisis, and the global partnership would be a broader thing that would surround it. but not the core. The core responsibility would be with the governments. And not only with the 8 governments, but with the G192, that is, with all the governments in the world, okay? And this is interesting because when I came here the first time, we had just finished 2008, the meeting in October. So I reported to the group here that, you know, the decision was taken to go for this struggle between the two sides. In January 2009, Zapatero, the Prime Minister of Spain, wanted to become part of Spain wanted to become part of the G8. They were not part of the G8. And they decided to invite a big conference in January to legitimize the global partnership and the idea of the G8. They invited several African delegations with 10, 15 people from each country. And they didn't invite the countries that were against the global partnership and were struggling for the Committee on World Food Security. But these countries came anyway, and civil society came anyway. And the whole thing happened is that at the end, the final declaration that it was supposed to come out did not really come out, legitimizing the partnership, and it was toned down, and the whole thing was really referred back to the CFS, that was the broader body. And you see the timing is very tight, and that shows because normally intergovernmental processes are not so fast. I think this shows the incredible priority that the issue of food is to the countries in the world and to the government, especially with the powerful governments. In 2009, in February, immediately 1 month after the Madrid conference, the Committee on World Food Security, the president of the Committee on World Food Security, an Argentinian ambassador, with the support of GRULAC, the Brazilians and the Latin American group and all this, the 38 countries from Latin America and Caribbean, they proposed to the G77 a reform of the CFS with the participation of civil society and private sector in the discussions. And a contact group was created, and this contact group prepared a document for the reform that was negotiated by the governments, line by line negotiated, and was approved in October 2009, and immediately followed by a new summit that reaffirmed the agreement. In this process, the CFS became the core. It was accepted by the governments that the CFS should be the core political platform, intergovernmental platform for the global partnership. As I mentioned here before, in parallel to that, we were having huge problems. Like, for instance, land grab intensified during the years of 2009. The estimates by the World Bank is that at least 1 France per year is grabbed in the international acquisition process, in the size of France per year. The most affected areas are Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And the process is incredible. You know, the transformation is the deforestation. This is one area that we're showing. See, this is, before it was like this. It was a savanna kind. Then you have, you see here, these chains. I was in this area myself. These chains here are chains about each ring is about this big, this thick. And what they do basically is they put 2 huge tractors with 2 chains like that, and then they go like this, very slowly, tearing every single thing out of the ground. And that's the end. That's how it looks after. And that's what happens to the wood. It's transformed into coal for the steel production and iron production industries. Totally illegal coal, usually produced using child labor. And that's the end. A soybean plantation or sugarcane or whatever in this case. Going back to the global governance, to the ground, to the international scene again. The final mission, the negotiation of the document of the reform was very important, and we came to this. The CFS, the Committee on World Food Security, is the foremost inclusive international and intergovernmental platform for food security and right to food. So it's not the global partnership, but the CFS, and the global partnership is built around it to support this process, but the decisions are taken by the states. The roles of the CFS would be to coordinate at global level, promote policy convergence, support and advise support and promote advice to countries and regions on how to face the problem. And additional roles, those were the biggest discussions, the biggest heavy discussions between the developing countries and the developed countries was exactly around these three. The EU played a role that very supportive of these ideas, but without full commitment, but supporting. And the additional roles were coordination and national and regional level, coordination at national and regional level, promote accountability and share best practice at all levels, and develop a global strategic framework on food and nutrition security. You might say, why were these so complicated to agree on? There was even a discussion where they said, in the additional roles, they say, instead of saying the CFS will have these additional roles, the big discussion was may have, or should have, or such as, things like that. And the big discussion was the commitment of the governments to coordinate their actions at national and regional level, to promote one thing that is accountability, how to be held accountable by their own peoples, and by how the intergovernmental agencies are held accountable to governments as such. This word is one word that everybody says in the intergovernmental negotiations, but very few people like to really put that in the paper. And we finally managed to do this, basically because the rich countries would like to hold poor countries on corruption charges, basically, and the poor countries would like to hold accountable the rich countries on their commitments to donate to assistance that they never meet. So these two interests of having accountability managed to have the word there, and now we are working how to make this accountable to the people and not only to governments. The structure of the CFS changed. The participants are the UN. No, the members are the states. They vote only. And that was a big discussion also. Some countries wanted the civil society, for instance, to vote, the private sector to vote. And we refused to accept that because we said that the final responsibility and obligation is of the governments. And therefore, they must decide. We participate in the discussion. We provide ideas so that you can decide better. The participants are broader: UN agencies, IFIs, WTO, international financial institutions, civil society and social movements, and the private sector. And 3 new bodies were created linked to the CFS. One is the advisory group to the Bureau, and I will explain to you how it works. The high-level panel of experts, that is basically an independent body of researchers that produces documents, independent documents for the governments to decide on. And the civil society mechanism, that is the way that civil society organizes independently and autonomously to participate in this process. Before the reform, the CFS had 5 members in the Bureau, 5 countries in the Bureau, and the Bureau met basically twice a year to prepare the annual session. There was nothing really in between. Now the Bureau has 13 members, and the Bureau meets every month to discuss the situation in the world and to take decisions on whatever is happening, and as well preparing this annual session in which the bigger decisions are taken and negotiations are carried out. For instance, the guidelines on land tenure that I mentioned is a decision of the CFS that is being developed throughout the year by the governments in an open-ended working group in which they negotiate the land guidelines. It's not in one session, but it's an ongoing process. The advisory group is a parallel to the Bureau. The Bureau has 13 states. The advisory group has 13 members. 4 of them are from civil society, social movements. Then we have the UN Special Rapporteur, we have the UN agencies that are involved, and the private sector, the World Bank, and the high-level task force. In the first year, we had an incredible increase in activities. The advisory group started working, the high-level panel started working. We had the first CSM meeting in 2010, really, the first CFS meeting in a different format, and it was totally different, and decisions were made and all that. In 2011, we started the negotiations of land tenure negotiation. We discussed how to support small-scale farmers, the issue of price volatility, and gender and nutrition. And all these discussions were done with full participation of civil society in the discussions, but the decisions, for sure, negotiated by government. This is the first time that governments take time and policy space to discuss food security outside of spaces where financial decisions are taken. Normally, food security is discussed by financial ministers when they discuss investments, or in WTO when they discuss trade rules. But food security was never discussed from the perspective of protecting the right of people to have food and the food security of each one. So the CFS has become that space right now. And we started in this last few months the process towards the global strategic framework for the CFS and for the countries. This means guidance on how countries could promote policies more coherent towards the eradication of hunger, and how the international community should relate to that and support that and not interfere. So